Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. How serious is the economic situation facing the country? That's the key issue I shall discuss today with the Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, C Rangarajan. Dr. Rangarajan, let me start with a simple question. With sharply falling growth, stubbornly high inflation and a worryingly large fiscal and current account deficit, do we have a serious problem on our hands, or even, as the Business Standard suggested on Friday, a small crisis?
Well, the Indian economy has slowed down. The growth rate for the last year is now estimated to be about 6.5%. This is a steep climb down from the 9% rate of growth which we had seen in the 3 years after 2005-06. It is also a climb down from the 6.9% rate of growth which was estimated earlier for last year. Therefore, there is a certain amount of concern about the slowing of growth. It is also true, as you mentioned, that slow growth is accompanied by high inflation and a high level of fiscal deficit and a high level of current account deficit. These are certainly disturbing elements in the system. But at the same time, we must recognize that the world economic situation is passing through a difficult time. And even with 6.5% rate of growth, India will be the second fastest growing economy in the world.
Let's pause for a moment and consider just how serious the situation is, and let's start with growth. As you said, we've come in with 5.3% in the last quarter, the worst in 9 years, 6.5% in the last year, way below the government's hopes. But actually, if you look at the April core sector growth figure of just 2.2%, which is about half of what it was this time last year, then in fact it would seem that the economy is not bottoming out. The economy instead looks like a diver who suddenly discovered that the sea is a lot deeper than he thought. Things could get worse.
No, I think the core sector growth rate, you should not attach that much importance. I mean, I think it is never a good indicator of how the industrial production as a whole behaves. Certainly, I will accept that there is a definite slowing of the growth of the economy. The question which you raised is, have we reached the bottom, or is there still some further sliding of the growth? In my view, we have reached the bottom. I would indicate that the growth rate for the current fiscal will be higher than the growth rate for last year.
Can I interrupt and put this to you? Suppose on the 17th of June the Greeks vote the wrong way and they throw out the bailout, exacerbating the Eurozone crisis. Suppose in July and August El Nino has an adverse effect on the monsoon, and both of those are possibilities. In those circumstances, do you accept growth in the year ending March 2019 could be badly affected and might fall below 6.5%?
Well, let's talk about what would happen normally, and then we can take it what could happen if things go wrong in the direction in which you are talking about. Yes, I would say that in the normal circumstances, with the monsoon being normal, with the European situation not getting worse, we should see a growth rate between 6.5% and 7% last year.
And if we don't have a normal situation, which is quite likely?
If the European situation turns into a big crisis, or if the agricultural output is affected because of a bad monsoon, then we will have to revise it downwards. But barring those circumstances, I would still say that the current fiscal will be better than last year.
Well, we're keeping our fingers crossed because the likelihood of the Greek vote going wrong is probably very high. But let me put something else to you. You're saying that the current fiscal will be better than the last fiscal, but the finance minister has targeted growth in his budget at 7.6%. No one really believes that's any longer likely or even possible. Would you accept 7.6% is going to be very hard?
At the moment, 7.6% looks very ambitious. But certainly 7% I will not rule out. It is still possible for the economy to grow at 7% next year. If you give me time, I will explain why it is so. But at this particular point, I would say that the growth of the economy at the rate of 7% in the current fiscal is not something that you can rule it out.
But the important thing is you're accepting 7.6 looks ambitious, by which I think you mean unlikely.
Well, I think at this particular point, it does look difficult to achieve.
In which case, doesn't this also raise serious questions about your fiscal deficit target of 5.1%? That was critically based upon growth of 7.6. If 7.6 is going to fall to 7, and some would say even 7 is perhaps unlikely, then 5.1 must be unachievable.
Well, the point is that the fiscal deficit is always calculated on what we call the nominal income. That is the real growth plus the inflation. Therefore, the overall nominal growth rate that they have assumed is somewhere around 13 to 14%. I don't think that that will go wrong very much.
You'll be saved by inflation, won't you?
To some extent, yes. The order of inflation could be between 6 and 7%, and therefore you could. But yes, as we go along, if the growth rate of 7.6% does not appear to be feasible at all, it requires even greater action on the part of the government to ensure that the fiscal deficit remains at the budgeted level.
Let's take stock at this moment, Dr. Rangarajan, because the one thing that you are fully accepting is that 7.6 looks unlikely. You're hoping we'll come in at 7%. Secondly, you're also saying that there are serious question marks about the fiscal deficit. Maybe inflation will help us out, maybe it won't. But what this suggests is that two critical aspects of the budget, the growth target and the fiscal deficit target, now look questionable, and it's not even 2 months since the budget was announced. That is bad news for India.
No, I think on fiscal deficit is a policy decision. I don't think fiscal deficit is something that can be left to the natural forces. Fiscal deficit is a variable which should be managed, and I would therefore urge that as far as the government is concerned, even before or even earlier, the achievement of the fiscal deficit mentioned in the budget was difficult. But if it turns out that we are not getting the kind of nominal growth rate that we had originally assumed under the budget, let us take more action and get the fiscal deficit down.
What you're saying, and I'm just interpreting this for layman, is that if it looks difficult that you're going to miss the fiscal deficit target, you need to take policy decisions to ensure that you do. I'll come to that in a moment's time. I want to leave the steps the government must take for a little later. I want for now to continue to explore how serious is the situation. Let's move on, and let me put this to you. The sliding rupee, and it's sliding pretty fast, is a sure indication that inflows coming into the country are halting, and that in turn is an indication that people are losing confidence in the Indian economy. Would you accept that?
Well, the sliding of the rupee or the depreciation of the rupee is due to the mismatch between the current account deficit and the capital inflows. Our current account deficit continues to remain high. This did not cause any problem in the previous years because the capital flows were adequate to cover the current account deficit. That is, financing of the current account deficit was not a problem, even though the current account deficit has been showing signs of rising in the last few years.
But the reason why now inflows are down is because overseas investors share the concerns Indian investors have, A, about the government's handling of the fiscal deficit, and B, about the fact that many reforms which they think are essential either have been promised and then gone back on, or simply haven't happened.
I think capital flows are influenced by two factors. One factor is external to us. I think whatever happens in Europe, whatever happens in the rest of the world, also influences the capital flows. There are risk aversion tendencies, and therefore, to some extent, the total capital flows into the developing economies itself is showing some signs of decline.
But the fact that we are not giving confidence in terms of how we manage the fiscal deficit, and the fact that we're not giving confidence in terms of reforms that people consider necessary which are not taken, that is adding to concern.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think that first of all is the overall flow of capital towards emerging economies, and the second is the country-specific problem.
And the country-specific problem, at the moment, many people believe is the real problem that India faces.
Well, it is adding to the problem, but I believe when the chips are down, the growth rate of the Indian economy, even at 6.5 or 7%, cannot be brushed aside.
That I accept. The problem is, will we maintain it at 6.5? That's a discussion we've had. I won't go back to that. Let me now raise with you another problem that faces the Indian economy. We have stubbornly high inflation. You yourself, the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, the Chief Economic Advisor, have variously said it will come down, but it refuses to come down. On the one odd occasion when it did come down, it went right up again. Would you accept that inflation has become the Achilles heel of this government?
Well, inflation is a phenomenon which affects a large section of the community, and therefore a high level of inflation is not conducive to economic growth, is not conducive to the prosperity of the country.
But has the government failed to tackle it?
No, let me come. I mean, I think I had in earlier as governor of the Reserve Bank taken a very strong position on that, and I have always regarded the primary objective of the central bank has been to tame inflation, to control inflation. Well, things have happened in such a way in the last 2 years. We have been confronted with a situation in which the strong action to control inflation was also viewed by some as coming in the way of faster economic growth. The first year of inflation was really food inflation. That is a totally different kind. Come the second year, what happened was that the food inflation got generalized. And in addition to it, there was some food inflation because of the rise in the price of vegetables. Now, any strong action on the monetary authority was viewed by some people as coming in the way of faster economic growth.
In fact, you got caught in a pincer. You had slowing growth, you had stubborn, if not rising inflation. What you did to tackle inflation would affect growth. What you did to generate growth would pick up inflation. You were caught in the middle of a pincer, which in a sense makes the problem even more intractable.
Yes, and that is why, in a sense, that very strong action to control inflation would have at that particular time meant even a slower growth, and that is why there was some hesitation. But I have no doubt in my mind. In my mind, as far as the monetary authority is concerned, the primary objective is to control inflation.
But let me then come back to the question with which I opened this interview. Given the series of problems we have with growth, with the fiscal deficit, with the sliding rupee, with intractable inflation, are you really sure this isn't a crisis, even if it's only a small one?
No, I think the crisis is slightly different in some ways. If you look at 1991 or something, that was a time in which, for example, even though we faced an acute balance of payments problem, and the exchange rate of the rupee was also depreciating, we had no reserves. We have a different situation now. We are now coming at a situation in which the economy had grown at a fairly rapid rate in the previous 4 or 5 years. We have adequate amount of reserves. But that is only a comfort. I mean, that is only a...
In which case, if the word crisis is wrong, would you accept serious problem as more accurate?
Yes, I think we face a critical situation.
A critical situation.
But I would rather argue that that is not something that we cannot overcome. I mean, I think it is given the kinds of policies that we want to pursue, it should be possible to grow.
Let's take a break at that point. I want to come back and ask you, how do we overcome this critical situation? That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with the Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, C. Rangarajan. Dr. Rangarajan, let's come to the steps the government needs to take. First, with a large fiscal deficit that could be difficult to rein in and sharply falling growth, would you accept that the need of the hour is to increase prices in diesel, LPG and kerosene?
I think there is a need to raise these prices because the fiscal deficit can be contained only if we act on cutting the subsidies, and the most important element in the subsidies program is the petroleum subsidies. Therefore, I would say that there is need for action on with respect to the prices on diesel and LPG.
So you're saying diesel and LPG in particular must be increased?
Yes, I think it should be done as early as possible.
As early as possible. So this is a top priority.
I would urge that action be taken in these two fields, but I must also mention there are different ways of doing it. There are ways of doing it in such a way that some low-income groups are not deeply affected, but the methodology or the modes of doing it will have to be thought through, but action is required.
Okay, secondly, would you say that now it is imperative that the finance minister live up to his budget promise of capping subsidies at 2%?
I think so. I think the finance minister has said it before, and I'm sure that he believes in what he has said, and therefore we need to move in the direction of cutting the subsidies and maintaining it at a certain proportion of the GDP, because that is the only element in the total expenditure of the government where there is some flexibility.
Let me sum up these 2 points. For politicians, raising diesel and LPG is always difficult. It tends to be unpopular. For finance ministers, cutting subsidies is unpopular. But you're saying these are difficult bullets they have to bite.
Obviously, I think this is very clear that there is a certain amount of resentment. There is some unhappiness about raising the prices of petroleum products and cutting the subsidies on some of the products. But given the kind of situation in which we are placed and where there is a compulsion to keep the fiscal deficit down, we need to take action, however unpleasant it may be.
Now, the other problem the finance minister faces is that you have growth that is very disappointing, and there's a danger it could get worse. Given that you have high inflation as well, there isn't much room for the RBI to cut interest rates. So does the finance minister need to boost investor and entrepreneurial sentiment by pushing ahead with reform?
We need to push reforms. I would only say that the reform environment has not deteriorated from 2005-06.
But it hasn't advanced either.
Yes, therefore we need to push it further. But certainly if we had grown at 9% during the earlier regime, we should be able to grow even now. But certainly reform is a continuing process, and therefore we need to take action in various fields such as banking, insurance and pension, and get the consent of the people to these reforms.
Now, some reforms are within the government's executive capacity to do, like FDI in retail, like FDI in aviation. FDI in retail was attempted last year. Within 10 days, the government changed its mind. Is it now critical for the government to bite this bullet and push ahead with FDI in retail?
FDI in retail is welcome. I think we should take action to get that done. But there is also a need to get some degree of consensus on it. We need to build it, but we must take early action in this area also, build the consensus and do it.
Now, one of the things that have worried foreign investors are what's called the combination of the Vodafone amendment, the Supreme Court judgment in the 2G case where 122 telecom licenses got cancelled, and the government's proposed GAAR amendments and proposals. The Financial Times says that it has even affected inflows in the last 2 months. Do you think the government needs to send out messages about these to reinsure investors?
Well, the pressure on the rupee that we have seen in the recent time has been because of the inadequate capital flows to cover the current account deficit. And therefore, we must encourage capital flows. And if the sentiment for that has to be created, I think we should do that. And we should examine critically the factors that might have come in the way of the perception of the investors and remove them. Some of the things that have been done by other countries as well, but perhaps they are being not viewed in the same way, and therefore there is some misconception there. But certainly we need to act to remove the impediments and encourage capital flows.
My last question, we're talking about decisions that are difficult. The Economic Times on Friday speculates that perhaps the government lacks courage. Does this government have the courage to take tough decisions?
I think the government has the courage. I mean, I think there are a number of problems that have come in the way of the government in taking economic decisions.
But it has the courage to do it.
But I think it has the willingness to do it.
Dr. Rangarajan, a pleasure talking to you, sir.
Thank you.